Why, hello there. I am Professor Pan, and welcome to the first lecture of Color Theory 101, a brief look into the electromagnetic spectrum and wavelength, where we look into all the various polychromatic variables within our visible light and memorize mathematical hex codes to understand the scientific algorithms that create the most perfect harmony in our picture. I'm just kidding. But can you imagine if we actually had to do that? So when it comes to color, it can be an incredibly detailed and difficult subject with lots of math and sciencey stuff about photons and light waves. And typically you'll always learn things such as, oh, if you put these colors next to each other, then they're analogous, or oh, if you put these colors next to each other in a triangle, then they're triadic. I've seen people teach this all the time, but I personally never learned this way. My art directors have never asked me for a triadic color environment design. Doesn't mean it won't happen one day, but usually if you're painting nature and such, then you really won't see this occurring very much. So I'll give you the basics, so you at least know the terminology, but you can always Google this stuff really easily. In fact, there's so many amazing YouTube videos out there where they actually just talk about this topic on how to categorize colors and color theory and just the specific terminology. What I want to teach you, though, is the practical application, the stuff that you won't get from these videos. But let's start with the color wheel. So here I have a color wheel, but I'm going to make an exact replica on the right so that you can compare and contrast what the differences are. The first thing I'm going to do is change the saturation. So what saturation simply means is how pure the color is. So if I take away the saturation, then it's going to appear more gray. And then slowly and slowly and slowly, it completely loses all of its color. And if we increase the saturation, then the opposite happens. Slowly, 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 the color comes back and it becomes stronger than ever before. It becomes so powerful that your eyes just start melting because of how bright it is. After that is lightness, or how light or dark the color is. So if I turn down the lightness, then all the colors slowly become darker and darker and darker and darker until they become completely black. And if I increase the lightness, the opposite happens. It goes lighter and lighter and lighter until you just see this pastel, and then it kind of just completely fades away into the screen. So traditionally in painting, when you wanted to make a color darker, that was known as a shade, where you mix the color with black so that slowly and slowly becomes darker and darker and darker. And then if you want to do the opposite and make it lighter, then that would be known as a tint, where you add white to the color and it becomes lighter and lighter and lighter. And then technically for saturation, if you don't want the color to be as pure as it is, then you would add gray to it in order to grab tone. So then it becomes more gray and more gray and more gray. But now with advancing technology, most photo editing and painting software simply use the word lightness. They don't really use the words tints or shades anymore. But it's still good to know where these things came from. In fact, typically when you look at your photo editing software, you'll find a tab more like this, where you can change the saturation of how bright the colors are. As you can see, if I go all the way down here, then it becomes completely gray. And if you wanted the colors to be lighter, then they'll turn the entire screen lighter. If you want it darker, then they'll turn everything darker. So we don't really use the terms shades or tints or tones anymore, but rather we use the entire term of saturation and lightness. Now, let's go back to our color wheel here and say that you take this red and you only paint and add whites, or you paint and add blacks, which simply means that you're only adjusting the lightness of this red. In that case, then you will get a monotone palette, where simply, if red is in your middle color here, then up is adding white and down is adding black. And that would be monotone. After that, you can divide the color wheel typically into one half, like so, where this is all warm colors, so warm, and then this is all cool colors, so cool. Think of like a fire, which is going to be yellow, This is a very poorly drawn fire. Or think of like an ice cube, or water, or it's cold. This is kind of the idea of it. Now, if you take one color and you go to the opposite spectrum, like this here, then this is known as complementary colors. Typically, you'll see that with yellow versus purple, or green versus red, and orange versus blue. If you have a color that only sticks to its close buddies, like so, like kind of like this, typically they take like 3 or they take like 4 colors in the wheel, then that would be known as analogous colors. So you'll see that they usually bind very closely to the color wheel, and you'll see either like red with orange with yellow, or green with darker shades of green and blue, or blue and purple. So those would be analogous colors. And you can get increasingly more complicated. But to be honest, after this point, it's really easily a Google click away. And truthfully, things like triadic and like triadic complementary, those are not really necessary for the next few steps. For me personally, I really never understood learning color with charts and theory, because to me, color was something that I learned by doing. By experimenting, I was able to find out what worked and what didn't. That's, for me, was the #1 factor of how I personally got good at color. So I hope to be able to teach you the same tips and tricks that I kind of utilized when I was learning color. Before we start that though, let's talk about the purpose of color. Why we study it at all. Because color is like a giant flavor enhancer. For example, if you drink water, which I hope you do, that's really important, but you add things like high fructose corn syrup and you add bubbles, and then bam, you'll get a Coke. Or in our concept art pizza, color would be the sauce, because it makes the crust that you made taste so good. The crust doesn't taste that good just by itself. Like, I'll just eat bread. I'm happy to eat bread, but with a sauce, so much better. But you can't have just the sauce without the actual crust part. Just like you can't have a Coke without the actual water part. Or you can't have muscles if there's no skeleton to wrap it around. This means that color is a giant enhancer, but it's usually not the main essence of the piece. The main essence of your piece will always remain to be black and white values and composition. Unless you're trying to do super abstract fine art, which, yeah, totally cool with me, but it's not what I'm teaching right here. However, let's be real here, is that the fun stuff is color. It helps us biologically differentiate between what different objects are, and also what is satisfying and what isn't. So we put color in our paintings to, #1, we let our audience know what the color of the actual object is, and it's also to bring a mood to our piece. Oftentimes, however, we already associate different colors with different things. For example, with red, we'd like to associate that with anger, or we associate with like fire, and with evil, or we associate with love. And then with yellow, we associate that with joy and friendship, sunlight, all kinds of happy feelings. Or we can also associate it with danger and caution. Next, we have green. Green usually emotes something about soothing, peace, and nature. It also represents things like harmony, and supposedly, according to scientists, looking at green is really healthy for your eyes, apparently. However, it can also be associated with sickness and disgust, or even jealousy, which is why they say green with envy. Then with blue, we associate that with sadness, or things like depression, but we also associate that with calm or peacefulness. And of course, things like the oceans and the sky and water. Then with brown, we associate that with things like mud and dirt and rust. But we can also associate it with stability and coziness, like hot coffee or chocolate or a beautiful wooden house. And no, I did not forget purple and orange. It's just that they're more rare colors, and it's also far easier to categorize them with either red and yellow or red and blue. By now, you've probably noticed that there's a dichotomy with all the colors, where there's a good side to them, and then there's also a very bad side to them. Essentially, colors are extremely versatile and are very flexible to fit your needs. But before anything else, you should ask yourself, for what kind of project are you painting for? Are you painting for feature film animation? In that case, typically your colors will be a lot more saturated. They're going to be more vibrant, and you can get really crazy with your colors, like beautiful pinks and neons and saturated blues, and no one will bat an eye. Or are you going for a very serious video game, like Last of Us 2? Then you're going to want to use a very muted color palette. Pink and purple would look really strange in this environment. And even if you make something very saturated, you should keep it in very low amounts. Even the blood on the main character, Ellie's face, is barely, red. Now let's go to the other extreme end. Are you going for something more abstract, like Monument Valley, where the color is bright and peppy and super saturated, like max saturation? Or the opposite of the spectrum? Are you trying to design something that is super sinister and monotone, with barely any color at all whatsoever, like Little Nightmares? You should ask yourself this question first, and see if you have a very specific message that you want to send with your color choices. In all of the examples that we showed so far, each of these use color in a very specific way. So now, let's dive into that a little bit more, and discuss what colors we should use for when, and also tips and tricks to get the exact color you want. I'm going to teach you not about color theory or the mathematics of color theory, but I'm going to show you how we see color in life, and how we can put that onto the canvas.